Taliban's sweep over Afghanistan a month ago was nothing short of jaw-dropping, leaving both their allies and their enemies divided and confused. In light of a humanitarian crisis, human rights issues, and the threat of an increase in terrorism, the debate in India at least has been to engage or not to engage. To walk us through the nuances of what the Taliban's impact might be on global jihad, joining us today, and we are very, very fortunate to have him join us, is Professor Bernard Haykel from the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, Director of the Institute of Transregional Study of the Contemporary Middle East, and one of the world's foremost scholars on political Islam and Islamic movements. Professor Haykel, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So Professor Haykel, let's start with a question that's been on everybody's mind since at least 2004. And that is, will the Taliban provide sanctuary to international terrorist movements? And what is going to be the impact on global jihad? Almost on cue, on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, there was a purported video statement from the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, where he mocked the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, but curiously did not make a reference to the Taliban's takeover, although there were earlier al-Qaeda statements referring to that.
Yes. My guess about the future is that the Taliban will allow al-Qaeda to stay put and be given sanctuary in Afghanistan. The question, though, is whether they'll allow al-Qaeda to wage attacks against targets and countries outside of Afghanistan. And my sense from what I've seen so far is that the Taliban will not allow al-Qaeda to do this. They'll have a much tighter grip on al-Qaeda, but it has to be remembered that al-Qaeda is a long-standing ally of the Taliban. The emir, or the commander or the leader of the Taliban, is considered the commander of the faithful by the al-Qaeda's leadership. Al-Qaeda has been very careful for since Mullah Omar's time to always give what is called bay'ah, which means an oath of allegiance to the leader of the Taliban, considering him to be the emir, and that the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is the nucleus from which, or the node from which, other emirates will be created, and eventually the caliphate. So al-Qaeda and the Taliban are intimately tied ideologically, but also with family ties, personal connections that go back decades. And I can't see that relationship being disentangled quickly. So as I said, and moreover, an important element in the Taliban, namely the Haqqani network, is very close to al-Qaeda, and they won't turn their backs on them. So we'll see. My sense is that at the moment, there are countries like not just the United States, but also Russia and China, who do not want al-Qaeda to launch attacks from al-Qaeda or anyone else from Afghanistan. That said, there's also this other group, the Islamic State in Khorasan, that hates the Taliban, considers the Taliban to be infidels, to have made a pact with the devil, with the United States, and there's been tremendous criticism in social media by ISK of the Taliban.
So based on that, since post 2002 and until now, in the last 20 years, what would have determined the Taliban's cooperation with other jihadist groups when they didn't necessarily have sanctuary to offer, and now they suddenly do? What would there have been any change with pre-existing relationships, al-Qaeda included?
Well, look, the Taliban, even though their ambitions are territorial in the sense that they appear to be confined in their interests only to the territory of Afghanistan, they do make a claim to being a legitimate Islamic movement, an emirate that wants to be recognized by other Islamists and around the world. So I think for the brand image of the Taliban, as well as for probably the financing that it hopes to get from certain countries, as well as help, it has to constantly burnish its image as an Islamic state. And so the Al Qaeda recognition of the Taliban is important for its uh, business, its marketing and business brand, if you like. It's also an important element in when it comes to dealing with states like Qatar and Turkey, that themselves are also supporters of different forms of Islamism, not necessarily the jihadis, although there are question marks about that, because both Qatar and Turkey have flirted with jihadis, global jihadis. So I think the Taliban need or use the Al Qaeda connection both for projecting a certain image internationally, but also I think there are divisions within the Taliban, including more hardliners, for whom the connection with Al Qaeda is extremely important.
Is almost indispensable, you might say.
For those hardliners, yes.
So now coming to the conflict that you brought up with ISIS Khorasan, we had the bombings at the Kabul airport, which was attributed to them. Despite some kind of link with the Haqqani network, you've talked about the Taliban and ISIS virtually being at each other's throats in Afghanistan. And apparently, most of ISIS Khorasan's cadres ex-Taliban fighters for whom had theological disagreements. Would you say their conflict is rooted in ideological moorings alone? Is this Salafism versus an interpretation of Deobandi school, or is there far more to this?
I think there is definitely an ideological component. I mean, there may be differences, that are specific to Afghanistan, but my sense is that the way their differences get expressed is certainly in terms of ideology. So let's take an example. One of the criticisms of ISK, or the Islamic State in Khorasan, of the Taliban is that the Taliban are willing to tolerate the Hazaras, who are 12 Shiites. In fact, what we saw soon after the takeover of Kabul, there was the annual commemoration of Ashura, which is a very important date for the Shia, and the Hazaras wanted to have a procession and a commemoration of this day, a day that basically commemorates the killing of Imam Hussein, a very important figure in Shia Islam. The Taliban offered protection for this procession. This is very different behavior from how the Taliban behaved, if you remember, when they were in charge, where they actually discriminated, persecuted, and killed Hazaras. They were absolutely terrible in their treatment of the Shia. This is a signal. It's a signal to Iran. It's a signal to the rest of the world that something has changed. And of course, the IS considers this a great betrayal, because one of the hallmarks of the Islamic State's ideological ambitions, as well as the way it sees the world, is that it regards most Muslims, especially the Shia, to be enemies, to be infidels, because they're in alliance with the West in some way. They also have global ambitions, whereas the Taliban seem to be much more national in their ambitions, as well as now more tolerant of the Shia. So yes, definitely there are, and there are other ideological and doctrinal differences that are fundamental. For instance, the Islamic State considers Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi to have been a caliph, the man who was killed by the Americans and the caliph of the Islamic State. They don't recognize the leader of the Taliban, Akhundzada, as a caliph or anything like a caliph. So there are important differences, absolutely.
Yeah. So the advent of ISIS Khorasan in Afghanistan seems to have changed quite a few things on the ground. Curiously, for Russia, and although this might be bound to change because of the factionalism in the Taliban and the fact that the National Resistance Front perhaps wasn't as much of a pushover as was thought, but the Taliban's reaction to the ISIS faction of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan seemed to have won at a few fans, so to speak, up north. And the Russian special envoy to Afghanistan, Zamir Kabulov, seemed to think that was an important development of sorts. Do you think that the threat from ISIS at some point could actually push the Taliban into cooperating with the US and some of its allies in the region?
So I'm more cynical than that, in that what I suspect the Taliban will do, and which is a tactic that is employed by many states actually in the Middle East, which is to say, look, we will keep ISIS contained and we will fight them as long as you support us. And if you don't support us, you're going to get this much worse group taking over, and then God help us. And this is a typical strategy that authoritarians use in the Middle East, which is to say to the United States and to the West, we know you don't like us because we're not democratic, we don't respect human rights, but do you really want these radical Islamists to take over? We're the one thing that's keeping them away from power. And I suspect that the Taliban will play this sort of game, and it'll be a bit of an act. It'll be some theater, because I suspect that the Taliban, if they put their mind to it, they can wipe out ISIS when they want. I don't think they want to, because it's a very convenient foil to use with the West and with the Russians and others.
So this begets the question: does such conflict actually contain what could be called global jihad, or does it somehow, is it a shot in the arm of sorts?
So the global jihad at the moment is truly global. I mean, I don't think, frankly, that what's going to happen in Afghanistan will affect what we're seeing in Africa and countries in the Sahel and Mozambique. I think that there's a dynamic that's proper to Africa. Where in fact most of the groups are Al Qaeda and not ISIS, in terms of affiliation. And I don't think that the events in Afghanistan are going to affect that. I also suspect that most of the attacks that the global jihadis have waged against the West have not been these large coordinated attacks like the ones we saw on 9/11. They're lone wolf attacks. I don't think that's going to stop, regardless of what happens in Afghanistan. You'll still have Al Qaeda and IS ideologues on social media, using Telegram, for instance, urging Muslims to attack in sort of a private manner. To basically, as a lone wolf, go take a knife, take a car, take a truck, and just kill Westerners.
Right. So now we've paid significant attention to Pakistani support of the Taliban in their quest for legitimacy, as well as material support and military support very recently. Yeah. However, Qatar quietly has actually provided perhaps the biggest game changer for the Taliban, and that was their Doha office, through which they started engaging with governments all over the world, including very recently India. Given the pushback that Qatar actually has faced from the Saudis and Emiratis regarding their support of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad, what does Qatar stand to gain from sort of being a gatekeeper of sorts for the Taliban?
So look, a little bit of history here. Basically the rise of Islamism in other words, Islam as a political ideology was something that the Americans, the Saudis, and the Pakistanis promoted, in the case of the Americans, from the late 1950s. Basically, this was an ideology and individuals that were promoted to fight communism and to fight leftist ideologies that at the time looked like they would sweep the entire Arab and Muslim world. So this was a big project. It culminated in the jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s, and then out of that big effort, state-sponsored effort, American, Saudi, Pakistani, you have this monster that gets created in the form of Al Qaeda. The Saudis, with the rise of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his father, King Salman, came to power in 2015, basically did it a complete about-face. They have acknowledged publicly that the flirtation, support, sponsorship of Islamism was a terrible thing to do. They claim that this started in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, and that the consequences of this have been terrible for Saudi Arabia. So In other words, we are no longer in the business of promoting, sponsoring, subsidizing Islamism anywhere in the world. And we're going to crush them domestically. And this is basically what MBS has been doing since at least 2016. So a void has been filled by Saudi Arabia's by Saudi Arabia's decision to do this, to stop doing this, and that void has been filled by Qatar and Turkey. They saw a business opportunity. There are all these guys who are disgruntled. They can be mobilized in different theaters, not just the radicals and the violent ones, but even the moderate ones. Let's say the Tunisian Muslim Brotherhood or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and so on. So Qatar has been very opportunistic, and it's a policy. It's a very small country, as you know, with a native population of about 200,000 individuals, and its big fear is Saudi Arabia. This is, let's say Qatar is to Saudi Arabia what, let's say, Bhutan is to India. Okay. So it's a country that is constantly thinking about how to maintain its independence. And the policy that it has adopted is basically to have an association, a flirtation, let's say, to be the mistress of multiple actors, the Americans with the big air base and military base, to have a flirtation with the Turks, to have a relationship with Iran, to have a relationship with the Taliban and with the Muslim Brotherhood and so on, to make itself indispensable. So when America wants to talk to the Taliban, it has to go through Qatar. When America wants to talk to, let's say, some Muslim Brotherhood faction, it has to go through Qatar. So that's been its own sort of strategic posture for survival and for independence. So far, it hasn't backfired, for Qatar. But I do think it is literally playing with fire, because these Islamists, as we know from the Saudi experience and the Pakistani experience, they often, it's very difficult to actually control them, for states to control them, and they often turn against their patrons, as happened with the Saudi case. In the case of Pakistan specifically, I think also, just like Qatar, and unlike Saudi Arabia, it has not given up on the the policy of using non-state actors, using Islamists, radical Islamists, to promote its agenda by pricking the Indians or pricking others, Right. But Pakistan will come under, and is coming under, tremendous pressure, because first, the Chinese don't like that. And the Chinese basically seem to own Pakistan today. They don't like the flirtation with non-state actors. Second, I think the Saudis also don't like it. And the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, regardless of how good the relationship is with India, between India and Saudi Arabia, Pakistan needs Saudi Arabia, as Saudi Arabia needs Pakistan for pan-Islamic causes and so on. So I think that my sense is that as long as the Saudis maintain this policy and are insistent on it, we're likely to see Pakistan also become more like Saudi Arabia, not entirely. And eventually, I think the Qatari-Turkish flirtation with Islamism will come to an end, because this relationship with non-state actors is a very dangerous one, and it's one that the main states and the main global powers don't like. And that doesn't include, that's not just the United States. I would say the Russians as well as the Chinese feel the same way.
It's interesting you brought up the tangible shift that Saudi Arabia has when it comes to dealing with these particular actors. However, interestingly, the Saudi foreign minister, Prince Faisal bin Farhan, was a part of the virtual ministerial meeting on Afghanistan, and has also made statements that could perhaps perceive to be conciliatory with the Taliban.
Yeah.
What do you think Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman hopes to do differently when it specifically comes to their engagement with the Taliban? Do you think that Qatar and Turkey's involvement might somehow impact the decision-making there?
I mean, there's no question that the Saudis are irritated by the by the importance that has been given to Qatar because of its relationship with the Taliban, and essentially the Qataris delivered the Taliban to the Americans, and that's something that the Saudis feel, no doubt, upset about. They see themselves as the leaders of the Muslim world, and they see that said, they didn't want to deal with the Taliban before the American withdrawal because the Taliban were considered a terrorist movement par excellence. Now that the Taliban are in power, I think what the Saudis are signaling to them is that fine, you want to be hard Islamists, that's okay, but as long as you remain a nationalist movement, don't have ambitions that go beyond Afghanistan, don't support non-state actors. If you choose the nationalist route, then we will have relations with you. If you choose to revert to the way you were before 2001, then we will not have relations with you as we once had. By the way, when the Taliban were in power from 96 to 2001, there were only 3 countries that recognized, I believe, the Taliban. And Saudi Arabia was one of them, the UAE was the other, and the third was Pakistan, of course. So I think the Saudis are basically signaling to the Taliban that, behave like a nation state and we will help you. If you don't behave like a nation state, then you can remain in the bosom of Qatar and suffer the consequences.
And interestingly, in the midst of all this, there's also been a somewhat quiet relationship with Iran that has been developing over time. And earlier, you brought up the Taliban's, perhaps you could call it lip service to Shia minorities within Afghanistan. However, it now seems like the Iranian establishment is split down the middle when it comes to the Taliban, particularly in light of what was happening in the Panjshir Valley very recently. And they seem to be hedging their bets. Which way do you think they'll swing?
The Iranians are pragmatists, and I think they realize that the Taliban are here to stay, and they will cut a deal with the Taliban. I mean, unless the Taliban revert to the way they were before, which was viscerally anti-Shia and promote anti-Shia movements. So I suspect and the Iranians have maintained their embassy. If I'm not mistaken, they've maintained their embassy in Kabul. They haven't shut it down. Which is an indication. When you see that the Iranians, the Russians, and the Chinese, and the Pakistanis, of course, have kept their embassies open. The Turks as well. You can already see, how these countries, what it is that these countries hope to accomplish, which is to have good relations with the Taliban. So my feeling is that the Iranians will be pragmatists on this. They will try to maintain good relations with the Taliban and accept that reality. By the way, I mean, I should also explain why, I should explain why I think the Taliban were able to win so handily and so quickly.
Please.
I mean, basically, if you speak to many Afghans, you hear that the previous government, the government that was of Ashraf Ghani and before him Hamid Karzai, basically these were very corrupt regimes. I'm not saying that the individuals at the very top were corrupt, but the regimes themselves were incredibly corrupt, and where you had a lot of abuse of power. And the one thing that the Taliban seem to provide is order, stability, and justice. It's a harsh form of justice, but it is justice. And I think there's a lesson in this, especially for the Americans, which is to say that more important than democracy and human rights and women's rights, much as these are important, if you have a chaotic and unstable society where violence is rampant and corruption is the order of the day, you're not going to be able to succeed in your project. And so all human beings need order and need justice before they need anything else. If you have no order and no justice, then democracy is really a luxury. And that's why the Taliban were able to succeed.
Correct. So we've had some interesting developments in India since the Taliban's takeover in Afghanistan. Very recently, we've had the heads of the CIA, the MI6, as well as Russian intelligence, and Actually, on the 19th, the Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, Prince Faisal, will also be visiting to discuss Afghanistan. India has already begun an engagement of sorts with the Taliban, yet a huge debate rages domestically over what that engagement should be. What advice would you give to our government if you were asked?
Yeah, so I think my advice would be to break with the old assumptions of the Cold War period, of the period in the 1990s. The world has changed, and the Afghanistan of today is not the Afghanistan of the 2-3 decades ago. So to assume what this means practically is the following. So to assume that the Taliban are merely the puppets of the Pakistani state and the Pakistani ISI is a mistake. There's no question that there's a strong relationship there, but it's a mistake to assume that it's just an extension of the Pakistani state, what we're seeing in Afghanistan. India has to have a relationship with the Taliban. It has to, be present. It has a historical role in that country and very strong ties to that country. And I think that the old ways of thinking about the country have to be given up, and to be more opportunistic and pragmatic in your approach, in India's approach to the Afghans. And I suspect that they will find that there are cleavages, there are sort of spaces between the Taliban and the Pakistanis that India can take full advantage of.
Professor Haykel, that was most insightful. On behalf of all of us here at Global Order, thank you very much for your time.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you, Ishan.